Charlie Kirk's death sent shockwaves throughout the United States and the entire world. And David, I appreciate you joining me today. Barna has some really interesting data about the impact of Charlie Kirk's assassination. And obviously, this has sparked what you've called a wave of reflection and action. We've seen this among younger generations, but let's get into the numbers. What did you find when you actually dug in and started asking the real questions about this impact?
Well, what's interesting is we were able to look at the impact across different generations, studying U.S. adults. We did a national sample about 2 months after the killing of Charlie Kirk. And we were looking at just overall awareness, sort of how much people had followed Charlie Kirk. And we found a couple of really key things. First of all, younger generations were much more likely to be familiar with Mr. Kirk. Millennials, Gen Z were much more likely to know about him. And actually, more than 8 out of 10 Americans knew of Charlie Kirk, even though very few followed him very closely. Of course, among practicing Christians, about half followed him pretty closely. But I think the most surprising finding from the research is that about 1 in 4 Americans report taking spiritual action as a result of Charlie Kirk's death. We didn't delve into what that was, but we find that 29% of Americans reported taking some sort of action as a result of his death in general, and spiritual responses were outpacing political ones. About 24% took spiritual action as a result of his death. This was much more common among young people, Gen Z and millennials. And about 11% took some sort of political action as a result of his death. As you might imagine, practicing Christians were even more likely to say that they had taken a moment of reflection or political action, but especially spiritual action as a result of his passing.
Yeah, it's interesting. You look at a lot of data and research, and you have for many years now. When I see a number like 29% reporting taking some form of action as a result of somebody's death, that's it feels, and correct me if I'm wrong, that's 3 in 10 people taking that sort of action. That seems pretty significant. We don't see a lot of events that sway people to that level, or am I wrong? I mean, you've seen a lot of these numbers on other issues.
Yeah, no, I think it was a really surprising and large impact given, again, how relatively small his deep following was before his death. And again, don't get me wrong, I think there's a real case to be made that he was a widely respected and widely
Sure.
known, although not closely followed figure. And so the fact that 3 in 10 Americans are saying there was some sort of moment of reflection, action that they were taking as a result of his death, I think is a significant impact. A sort of it carries on with some of the larger changes that we're seeing in our research about people having a moment of spiritual reflection, openness to Jesus, open to church going. Bible reading is rising up, especially among younger generations. So it seemed as though this comes at a time when there's already an openness to spiritual renewal. And I think it is a surprising finding for sure to just see how widespread his impact is.
Yeah, I mean, you look at this, and a lot of anecdotal conversations were happening. I was talking to pastors who were telling me. I talked to one pastor in New York City where I am. He told me he had 500 people show up. Actually, not show up, come up to the stage and accept Christ the first weekend after Charlie Kirk's death. And I heard that again and again from other pastors, but those are anecdotals, right? So to have numbers showing, okay, no, something did happen here, particularly with young people. And I know you said, you didn't necessarily get into the specifics of the spiritual responses, but I wanted you to just unpack that a little bit more, because obviously there are spiritual responses, political responses. How did you ask that question, just sort of generally?
Yeah, essentially, we said, have you personally taken any action since the passing of Charlie Kirk? And that gave us a measure. We gave people options of yes, a spiritual action, yes, a political action, yes to both, or no. And 71% of Americans said they had taken no action, but that leave 29% who said they'd taken either a political or spiritual action or both. And again, I think it's been such a heartbreaking season for those that closely followed Charlie Kirk, and of course, just the tragedy itself on the face of it is such a sad turn of events. But we have not had a political figure like this that has been assassinated for some time, and just the widespread impact of that seems to be really interesting. What we did look at was ways that people said that might have a positive or negative impact going forward. And people are really split on these. We gave people 5 different options to choose from: Christianity among younger generations, the ability to have civil political conversations, politics in America in general, ending gun violence, and cooperation between conservatives and liberals. And basically, across all US adults, it was only Christianity among younger Americans that was, by and large, by almost 3 to 1, chosen as the likely long-term impact of Mr. Kirk's death. So 47% to 19% among all adults, and 71% to 11% among practicing Christians. So very interesting findings there. It was actually younger Americans who were also more likely to attribute that as the likely positive outcome. Again, this notion that people are seeing his impact much more spiritually oriented than politically oriented. And the others were sort of mixed, whether people thought it would be either a positive or a negative impact going forward. But overall, people are looking at Charlie Kirk and his legacy as much about his spiritual impact as his political impact.
Yeah, and it's so interesting to watch all of it and sort of see the parallels. You know, a lot of people assuming that Charlie Kirk was just this political figure, right, and not realizing even that there was a massive part of the work that he was doing was spiritual in nature. And so it's interesting to see these results. And you mentioned being a little bit, surprised by that 29%, because I think that's a pretty significant, again, response. And I can't, underscore that enough, that I can't think of a lot of things that motivate people to take action, and that many people to take action. But just to talk a little bit about younger Americans, it is interesting because in your data and in other data, we continue to see young people and young men in particular showing up, reading the Bible more, having interest in faith. And so this sort of coincides with that. I don't know if you want to speak to those broader, sort of trends that we're seeing among young people right now. If you had told me 10 years ago, 5 years ago, that we were going to see the young generation having this resurgence in interest in faith, I would have said you were lying. And yet here we are.
Yeah, no, I think this is one of the most significant spiritual stories that we've been tracking for a number of years. And listen, the data is mixed at certain levels when you look at certain kinds of comparisons to 25 years ago. Practicing Christians are less common. There are some other ways that we could just be really cautious about the language we use around whether this is a spiritual revival or what sort of extent this is happening. But the data is pretty clear as well, as you're sort of alluding to. Younger Americans, Gen Z and Millennials, are much more likely to say they've made a commitment to Jesus. That's still important in their life. That is a huge result. There's 30 million more Americans today who say that that is true than compared to just 4 years ago. So there is something that is stirring in our society as people are interested in Jesus. We see it reflected in some Bible reading increases. We see it in church going increases. We see it overall, as you mentioned, among young people, and just surprising to us as social researchers among young men. And again, I think the jury is still out. Even researchers are trying to debate, trying to understand what's happening, because something seems different. Our data is certainly showing that, although again, there's some other areas, even of Barna data, that's showing flat or plateauing. So I want to make sure we paint that accurately. It seems as though what's happening is younger Americans, Gen Z, and young men are going back almost 15, 25 years to levels they would have been a previous generation, and maybe even higher. And so it seems to me that, again, as a longtime researcher, having done this now for 30 years, we just don't often see that younger generations are more religiously active than older generations. We hardly ever see that men are more religiously active than women. And something seems to be stirring. And again, I characterized the results for Charlie Kirk's killing, the fact that people are taking these spiritual actions, as fitting in a larger pattern of spiritual change. And there's some sort of deep waters that are being stirred up. And I believe, as a Christian who wants to see the vitality of the church today, that these are the days we have been praying for. We are praying that our kids and grandkids, that the next generation would find Christ, would find a vitality to their faith, to their Christianity. And we're seeing openness bubble up all across our society. And we can continue to pray that God would make most of that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think when you look, I mean, there's even been some interesting surveys, and I don't know, you would know better than I would probably, but I don't know if you saw the high school survey showing that for the first time, young men in high school were more likely to say they wanted to get married one day than young women. And so we're also having this broader conversation about, Charlie Kirk had an impact on women. There's a lot of speculation that his wife, I'm sorry, men, that his wife Erica may have an impact on women. We'll see if that's the case. But there's interesting trends all around, and as you said, complicated trends, but also some really encouraging ones with young people. And so I love what you said there. We'll kind of close out on that. That this is the time to be praying for what we've been hoping for, especially among young people. Watching young people show up on college campuses to worship, to seek Christ. This is a very unique time, and I appreciate the data and the research that Barna put out on this. Thanks for your time today.
Of course, Billy. Great to be with you.